Now, I stand here before you, a product of the environment, which is being degraded, and a product of genetics, where we see a breakdown in family values. As a consequence, I wish to have absolutely no responsibility for any of my actions. Now, that would not get me far in a court of law, and it would not put me in a very authoritative position to talk about the UN's view of the future of youth. Now, naturally, I don't aspire to those sentiments. However, I think we should bear in mind that young people today often feel along those lines. There's a sense of uncertainty, what's ahead, as we project forwards. Uncertainty in the context of the ecosystem, context of resources. How much will we have in terms of water, in terms of energy? Also uncertainty in terms of education systems. Will these be in a position to provide relevant education and training? And then, naturally, employment. Will young people have employment opportunities, decent work, and meaningful jobs? And then there's a whole range of other issues related to this. We look at will they have the opportunities to enter into stable, meaningful relationships? Will they have the opportunities to have families, as we know today? Many of these variables are unknown. We can project forwards, though, in terms of demographic data. So I'm going to put up some demographic data to look at numbers. We can't project that much in terms of the sectors, education, employment. We roughly know dependency ratios, but other investments are very specific at the country level. Technology is one variable which we know will change rapidly. We do not exactly know what direction it will move into, but one thing for certain, it will have an increasing impact on people's lives. And this is very relevant. It's relevant because with the coming changes, young people will need to be, in many ways, far more resilient than they have been in the past, far more active. And we see technology is really a double-edged sword. And I'd like to come back to that later, after we go through some of the data. Now, this first graph gives you just an indication of the numbers. The numbers and the years are, can we zoom out at all on the slide? We should get the is there a moving mic as well, if possible? Anyhow, the lower gauge or years, the 2014, the latest year for data, is in the center there. On the extreme right is 2050. So these are projections moving forward. On the left axis, you're going to have absolute numbers in the millions of people. We have, in the Asia-Pacific region, 4.2 billion people. That is projected, thank you, that, better sound, that is projected to increase considerably. The youth band, the 15 to 24, peaked in the year 2010, 750 million young people. Since then, it's been decreasing by about 10 million per year. Last year, 2014, 717 million. It will continue to decrease and stabilize at approximately 700, just under 700 million people across Asia and the Pacific. This band below, the 0 to 14, reductions in fertility slowly having an impact, a tightening there. This relevant age group, 25 to 64, productive workforce, although many start work before that, continues to expand and then stabilizes. The biggest demographic challenge, and it will have an impact on everybody, not just young people, is the upper band, the 65 plus. Only small here, only about 300 million people. When we get to the end here, we're about 1.2 billion people. So a tremendous increase in the numbers of older persons, especially 65 plus. It's not a uniform change, though. If we see the two big countries of the region, projecting to 2060, you'll get an indication that in China, there were some peaks. In the 80s, we had the one-child policy coming then down, and a rapid decline really since around about 2010. That's why at that point the population for the entire region peaked. In India, though, still coasting high for another 20 or so years before coming down. That indicates that India is still in the process of the demographic dividend, or having that dividend, having the boon of a youthful labor force. And we'll come back to that shortly. Here we have the share of youth as a percentage of working age population. Unfortunately, the countries are not showing up, but I can tell you that here is Timor-Leste. The green is the year 2014. The purple dot is the year 2025. So many countries with rapid reductions. Timor-Leste here, Afghanistan here, then mainly South Asia countries, which have sizable youth populations still in the position to benefit from the demographic dividend. I think Australia's round about here. The really low ones are Japan, and I think this is a very interesting one, Sri Lanka, because you see a considerable drop with rapid aging there. These are the 5 sub-regions of Asia and the Pacific. It's a very diverse region. This is South and Southwest Asia, where we have India, we have Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Afghanistan, all countries with relatively youthful populations. Here is East and Northeast Asia. This is where we have China, Mongolia, Japan, Republic of Korea, Democratic Republic, and we see a significant drop. In relative terms, that's the biggest drop of any of them. And that part of the world, East and Northeast Asia, is where it's going to be at the front line of demographic change, of aging. And I think in Australia, you're not quite there. You have a combination of both an aging population, but also quite a youthful population. But Australia as a country will need to put in place a series of policies to be prepared for the demographic change, as well as the related epidemiological change. So as you will know, medical costs, healthcare costs increased rapidly in the last few years of life. So investments in that domain are very important. It's relatively easy for the higher income countries, but the lower income countries with high fertility, large youth populations, definitely need to act now to put in place systems so they will be prepared for the future. Here we look at the aging population in numbers, in percentages. The striking one is actually Japan here. 30% will be over the age of 65 by 2030. We've heard a lot about China. This data is not that indicative. If we go beyond 2030 to 2050, that figure jumps considerably. But it's also one in which there's considerable variation. In some of the coastal towns, already you have figures of 30%. In Nanjing, for example, in Beijing, Shanghai, we have high figures. We have other populations, especially in India, we see a much more gentle increase. However, beyond that, we can expect the increase to be greater. Again, going back to what we've been discussing in the context of youth, there is this demographic dividend, something which Australia, with a youthful population, can also benefit from. This next slide looks at the median age of the population in East Asia. So again, going back to these more advanced, in the demographic sense, societies. Dramatic change. We're currently a median age of approximately 35. It's going to go up to almost 40. So that's the largest group. The largest group in terms of numbers will be in that age group. That's not a bad age, actually. Coming on the other axis, we look at the potential support ratio. That is the ratio of those of working age to older persons. Now, that drops dramatically. 5.7 is still manageable, but 1.6 is an exceptionally low figure. That means for every one older person, there are less than 2 people in the working age population. Now, there will be changes. Pensions will have to kick in later. Retirement ages will have to be later. There will have to be ways to do this. But just to give an indication of the numbers, we can see that figure. In contrast, again, I want to stress Asia and the Pacific is a diverse region. In South Asia, it's a different story, although the trend is similar. Much more youthful population, currently around about 26 in 2050, about 10 to 12 years younger than in East Asia. And the support ratio, likewise, much higher, currently around about 9.4, 3.8 in 2050. Again, it's over double the rate in East Asia. So still not as significant constraints when we get to 2050, but beyond that, there will be major changes and investments are needed. So healthcare across the life cycle. In Australia, you may complain about your healthcare system. I'm not too familiar with it. However, I'm sure it's infinitely or considerably better than that in many other countries of Asia and the Pacific. So we've jumped ahead. So when a country becomes more developed, as in Australia, we move away from emphasis on the social protection floor to one on increasing equity. Let's just go through the other three factors in the social protection floor. The second one relates to education, income support. So to allow children to go through school, to have school meals and have a good education. The third one relates to income in the context of employment. So unemployment benefits, including disability benefits, sickness benefits, and so on. In Asia and the Pacific, coverage of these is often below 20%, meaning that only 20% of the labor force, usually those in the civil service, have such benefits. But in some countries, 70% of the population is in the informal sector, and that it especially applies to young people. So young people often in the informal sector, they become unemployed, they have no support to fall back on. The need to invest in this, especially if we project forwards. Now, the third one is pensions. Old age pensions are fundamental. Countries like China, if they don't invest in them now, there will be challenges. Fortunately, they are. But other countries with aging populations, or at least those in South Asia projecting forwards, need to invest in such schemes. Moving back to the situation in Australia. Equity needs to be at the forefront now. You have in place systems which are relatively universal in coverage, I would say, but not universal in outcome. In outcome, if you look across the population groups, if you look at persons with disabilities, older persons, migrants, indigenous populations, if we look at these, we see certain pockets where inequality is very pervasive. So that is a domain where investments are absolutely necessary. So if we, again, in the center of this schema is basically the UN's approach to addressing the role of young people in the years to come. We divide the schema into 5 areas. Employment, and we have agencies focusing on that, the ILO and employment. We have then health. Obviously, you have WHO, UNFPA, sexual and reproductive health services, very important. Education, UNESCO, and others. Civic engagement and political inclusion are 2 very closely related variables. UNDP is one of the main players. But what the UN is trying to push for is an increasing role of young people in various processes. Young people are not, in the Asia-Pacific region, are not that engaged. If we look at the indicators of civic engagement, about 14% of young people have actually spoken to a public official, or rather expressed their concerns. That's a very low number. It reflects disenfranchisement to a large extent. It reflects also a distance between young people and leaders. So coming back to what I mentioned about technology. Technology, and if you'll excuse me, I'll have a drink. Technology is a double-edged sword because technology allows people, hopefully, to benefit. People to benefit in the context that life is made easier. And innovation is a fundamental mover of technology. But young people nowadays, the technology they use or spend time with does not increase a very important facet of resilience. And since everyone's been very quiet, I would like somebody to interject. What element of resilience is the modern technology going against? Very true, yes. I think you hit it on the nail. It's that mental capacity to be able to solve problems, to be able to concentrate. Concentration spans, I assume some of you are in the education sector. Concentration spans have not done that well over the last 30 years. I think the research in Australia will support research in other OECD countries. The capacity to sit still and to stay calm and to then generate creative energy is something which young people are finding more and more difficult to attain. It's a lot to do with doing things quickly, instant gratification, instant enjoyment. Now, enjoyment is important, but you may be aware that nature, if we go back to the ecosystem, is a teacher of ours in terms of cycles. We see cycles. So the human being is not separate from that. We cannot escape those cycles. The technology, I believe, will never get us away from those cycles. And the more we engage in technology, the more we are deceiving ourselves. Because we are moving away from origins which, in this country, I believe your indigenous community had a great awareness of. You see it across other countries in Asia, the connection to the land, but not necessarily being a farmer, but understanding processes, understanding the process of nature and humanity's role within that context. And that relates to consumption. So if we look at the role of youth in the future, or the future for youth, current consumption patterns are certainly not sustainable. Young people have to be more aware of that than the existing generations. We cannot expect that we will have enough resources to go around. We have to then get young people more involved. They have to be more actively participating in decision-making to come up with solutions. The year 2050, 35 years from now, we know the demographic data. There's going to be tremendous pressure on the resources around us. We need solutions. And unless young people can combine innovative ideas, ways to address these ecological threats, ways to address inequality, because it's all well and good, you may say, economic solutions, but economic solutions are driven by competition, and competition inherently brings about inequality. That will not resolve things. We need new paradigms, and I think young people, the advantage with technology, being more connected, they can share experiences much more effectively. I will talk later today about an alliance we have formed, mainly driven by young people. Their main role is sharing of experiences, and it's amazing the potential they have, the ideas they can come up with when given the space, when given the tools. So, going back to the traditional knowledge, that lack of connection with what is taught in modern curricula is a disadvantage. Bringing in awareness of topics which young people should have exposure to, yet are considered taboos in society, leads to complications later in life. How many people in class discuss, for example, death? Death is just a natural process. How many people discuss, again, this is dependent on society, how many would discuss openly issues related to drugs and sex? There are appropriate times for that, but I think they can be discussed more openly in a constructive manner. Gender identity as well. How many people discuss inequality, deprivation relative to wealth? How many people discuss the connection with the land in terms of our own mortality, our own existence, our own meaning? Now, these are subjects which are often pushed to the side because we're distracted by a modern consumerist society. We don't have time to think about them. But innovation will give us that time, quite possibly. We may have more time on our hands if the androids make play a more active role in the production of output. But moderation is the key, and I would like to tie things up with moderation. Moderation, but fortitude and resilience. Young people, they do not face necessarily the best future ahead of them if you look at current trends. If you look at going back again to consumption patterns, the future is not bright. However, things can change. That is up to young people, but it is all up to, or rather up to policymakers, business leaders, those in civil society organizations, in academia, to likewise play a role. So if I could leave you with one message, it would be the need to listen to youth, to get them involved, to get their creativity out in the forefront. It's not just the rhetoric. It's actually making them the thinkers in the programs, making them come up with the ideas, and giving them space to have some responsibility for the outcome. We mentioned, or we heard earlier about failure breeds success, and over. It's a cycle. It's a cyclical thing. But ultimately, if we work together, if we understand there's a common good, I think we can go from strength to strength. Now, I believe I've done a half an hour, just short of half an hour, and I believe there may be some questions, so I'm open to any questions. I apologize for the slides. I should have tested the resolution first.
Marco's actually come in early, so we've got a couple of minutes for questions if anyone's got one.
I thought it interesting that the countries with the biggest populations are also tend to be the ones with the most hierarchical societies where youth does not generally get much of a voice. So I suppose it concerns me a little bit when you say things like it's up to young people, where in countries like China, so the protest that we saw in Hong Kong a few months ago, that's very unusual for people of Chinese background, because normally, you know, young people don't speak out against what the older people are saying. So what are you doing, what's the UN doing to also engage people of other generations to be able to kind of say, it's okay, yeah, you know, it's okay to speak out against this?
That's a very interesting question, which is very politically loaded. In the if you're familiar with the situation in China, it's a complex one. I do acknowledge that young people are not in a strong position to speak out. Within the UN, we push as much as we can. We are restricted by the member states, but they can obviously change the way we do our work. They can block resolutions. They can, but ultimately we have to work with them and encourage them, not saying what they're doing is wrong, but saying that there can be improvements. So within China, to introduce democratization would be a very complicated process. Within other countries, in India, obviously it's different. Within Hong Kong is a specific case we have to, again, I would say, deal with caution to. I would say, though, that Australia, you can play a lead here. You can show other countries in Asia and the Pacific, because here they have more space. I still think the opportunities are not taken, but I think the countries where there is more scope for it can show that success can come about by working more with young people.
Yeah, I think the issue is less about democracy and more about cultural values. When we look at most of the African countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, it's the hierarchy within those cultures that stops people speaking out. It's not whether or not they are a democracy.
No, hierarchy, certainly cultural factors are indisputably major issues here. I don't want to put the word obstacle into the equation, but we obviously here, we view things in a certain perspective. If we look at the views of young people themselves, then they come up with three main things they want. They want, across Asia and the Pacific, better education, better jobs, and better healthcare. For them, that's it. How that happens, of course, relates to the structures of society. It relates to the cultures they're situated in. I do think changing those, especially gender is an important dimension. I didn't mention that only 48% of young people are women, while it's 52% are men. So that, largely because of China and other countries in East Asia, sex selection at birth, also in India, that will have a role. They're very patriarchal societies. We need change. Again, I think it does ultimately have to come through partnerships, but the young people showing that they can achieve things, showing that they can. It's a lot to do with governance. These cultures often have low indicators of transparency and accountability in terms of governance. So I would say a multi-pronged approach, building capacity among the young people, hopefully reforming the education sector, getting some champions for change. It's not going to be an immediate process in those settings. That's why I keep saying, where it's easier to effect that change, I think these should be used as examples. So Australia has a big challenge there.
Okay, does anyone else like another question before we close? We've got a couple of minutes, so feel free. No? Marco, could you tell me, is there one thing that we can learn and build into our future planning for Australia? We've just had an intergenerational report released here. Is there one thing that you would say policymakers has a take-home with these future trends that we should be doing here?
In Australia?
Yeah.
In the context of looking forward?
Yes.
You're going to, as a country, going to face this squeeze on the old age support ratio, for sure. Whether it's 10 years, 30 years, 50 years. I think there's tremendous energy. I saw it yesterday. I've seen it today. The young people, great potential, great opportunity, multicultural setting. But what I would stress is the need for young people, and this can be encouraged by policymakers, the way they look at older people, the way they look at the aging process. They will ultimately be those older people later. Do we want it to be that with such a sizable population of older persons, do we want it to be that they're off in homes for older people, or do we want young people to be more engaged across the spectrum? So here we'll move into volunteering. Obviously they need jobs, but I think the government has to encourage greater community spirit, especially though for those in greater need. And I think that intergenerational element is one where you can't expect the families to take care of everything. The state has to play a role. But I think the families themselves should have a greater interest in older people. I don't know any of you if you look at the relationship between grandparents and grandchildren, it goes very, very well. When those children there enter their teens, something funny happens. I think there's an area where we can change that and continue those connections, so even into older age, there's greater participation. So I think that intergenerational contract is a very important one.